On a sweltering afternoon in suburban Denver, Marcus Williams stepped out from behind his backyard swimming pool, water still dripping from his gray t-shirt and athletic shorts. The 52-year-old black man had been enjoying a rare moment of peace when the sharp wail of police sirens cut through the air like a blade. 3 officers emerged from their patrol car, their eyes cold and calculating, voices already laced with contempt before a single question was asked. Without hesitation, they began shouting, hurling degrading words like weapons. "What's a guy like you doing living in a neighborhood like this?" Before Marcus could even respond, rough hands seized him, slamming his body against the concrete driveway. His face pressed into the hot pavement, a knee driven hard into the back of his neck, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He offered no resistance, his eyes filled with a familiar mixture of rage and resignation. But when the officers reached into his pocket and pulled out a gleaming police chief's badge, all 3 men froze in absolute terror, their faces drained of every drop of color. The story begins on Elm Street, in one of Denver's most affluent neighborhoods, where manicured lawns stretch like green carpets and luxury vehicles sit pristinely in circular driveways. Marcus Williams had called this place home for nearly 8 years, yet his presence continued to be a source of whispered conversations and suspicious glances. Standing 6 feet tall with graying temples and the weathered hands of someone who had worked his way up from the streets, Marcus carried himself with quiet dignity that somehow made his neighbors even more uncomfortable. Every morning, he would emerge from his colonial-style home to retrieve the newspaper, nodding politely to joggers and dog walkers who would quicken their pace when they saw him. The elderly woman next door, Mrs. Patterson, would peek through her curtains whenever he tended to his roses, as if gardening while black was somehow suspicious behavior. The young couple across the street would hurry their children inside whenever Marcus appeared on his front porch, their protective instincts triggered by nothing more than his skin color. Despite holding one of the most important positions in the city, Marcus had learned to move carefully through his own neighborhood. He kept his hands visible when walking, avoided wearing hoodies, even in cold weather, and always carried multiple forms of identification. These were survival tactics learned through decades of experience, habits that even success and authority could not entirely erase. The house itself stood as a monument to Marcus's achievements. 3 stories of brick and stone, complete with a 3-car garage and the kind of swimming pool that appeared in home and garden magazines. Yet somehow, its very existence seemed to offend the sensibilities of neighbors who could not reconcile their preconceptions with reality. How could someone who looked like him afford something like this? The question hung in the air at neighborhood barbecues and homeowners association meetings, never spoken aloud but always present. For months, the whispers had been growing louder. Phone calls to police had become routine whenever Marcus was seen doing ordinary activities, washing his car in the driveway, bringing in groceries, or simply sitting on his own porch reading a book. Each incident was reported as suspicious behavior by anonymous callers who seemed to believe that being black in their neighborhood was inherently criminal. The pattern was as predictable as it was infuriating. Someone would call the police, claiming to have seen a suspicious individual who didn't belong in the area. Officers would arrive, ask perfunctory questions, and leave with apologetic shrugs. The cycle would repeat itself a few weeks later, each time chipping away at Marcus's faith in the community he had hoped to join. On this particular Tuesday, Marcus had taken a rare day off from his demanding position as chief of police. The morning had been spent reviewing budget reports and personnel files, but the afternoon belonged to him. He had changed into casual clothes and decided to clean his pool filter, a mundane task that brought him unexpected satisfaction. There was something therapeutic about working with his hands, about accomplishing something concrete and immediate. The water felt refreshing against his skin as he adjusted the pool's chemical levels, completely absorbed in the task at hand. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to forget about the weight of his badge, the constant scrutiny, and the impossible balance he maintained between being a law enforcement officer and a black man in America. This was his sanctuary, his one place where he could simply exist without having to prove his right to be there. But even in his own backyard, Marcus was not truly safe from the suspicions of his neighbors. Mrs. Patterson had been watching from her kitchen window, and what she saw, a black man moving around the property with purpose, triggered her well-worn pattern of fear and assumption. She reached for her phone and dialed 911, her voice trembling with artificial urgency as she reported an intruder at the Williams residence. The dispatcher asked routine questions about the nature of the emergency, but Mrs. Patterson's responses were vague and contradictory. She claimed the man appeared to be casing the house, despite the fact that he was clearly engaged in pool maintenance. When asked if she had seen any actual criminal activity, she hedged and suggested that something just didn't look right. The dispatcher, following protocol, sent a patrol unit to investigate. Officers Jake Martinez, Tommy Rodriguez, and Brad Stevens had been partners for 3 years, working the same beat and sharing the same attitudes about their work. All three men were in their early 30s. Products of working-class backgrounds who saw police work as both a calling and a way to assert authority they had never possessed in civilian life. They approached each call with a combination of professional cynicism and personal prejudice that had been reinforced by years of selective enforcement. As their patrol car turned onto Elm Street, Martinez was already forming opinions about what they would find. In his experience, calls from this neighborhood usually involved false alarms generated by racial anxiety. But he and his partners had learned to take them seriously anyway. It was easier to intimidate a black resident and move on than to challenge the prejudices of white homeowners who controlled the political landscape. The house at 1742 Elm Street was impressive enough to generate resentment in men who lived in modest apartments and drove aging vehicles. Rodriguez commented that someone was living pretty high on the hog, while Stevens suggested they might find evidence of drug dealing or other illegal activity. The assumption that a black man could not legitimately afford such luxury was so automatic that none of them questioned it. They parked directly in front of the house, their presence immediately visible to anyone in the neighborhood. This was intentional, a show of force designed to establish dominance before any actual interaction took place. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the quiet street, drawing attention from nearby homes where curious faces appeared at windows. Marcus heard the commotion but did not immediately connect it to his own situation. Police cars were not uncommon in any neighborhood, and he assumed they were responding to some routine matter elsewhere on the street. He continued working, completely unaware that he was the target of their attention. The officers approached through the front yard, their hands resting casually on their service weapons. They could see Marcus in the backyard through a gap in the fence, and what they observed, a black man moving with purpose around an expensive property, confirmed their worst assumptions. None of them considered the possibility that he might belong there. Martinez took the lead as they made their way around the side of the house, his voice already raised before they had even made contact. "Hey, you there. Stop what you're doing and turn around." The command was sharp and aggressive, designed to establish immediate control over the situation. Marcus looked up from the pool filter, surprised by the hostile tone but not yet alarmed. He had been dealing with police his entire life and understood the importance of remaining calm during any encounter. "Good afternoon, officers," he said, his voice steady and respectful. "Is there some kind of problem?" The respectful greeting only seemed to agitate Martinez further. In his worldview, criminals often tried to appear cooperative in order to throw officers off guard. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "We got a report of suspicious activity at this address. You want to explain what you're doing here?" Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with these encounters. Despite his position and authority, despite decades of public service, he was still just another black man in the eyes of these officers. "I live here," he said simply, gesturing toward the house. "This is my home." Rodriguez laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Your home? Right. And I'm the Queen of England." The other officers joined in the laughter, treating Marcus's completely truthful statement as an obvious lie. "Houses like this don't belong to people like you," Stevens added, his voice dripping with disdain. The casual racism was so matter-of-fact, so automatic, that Marcus felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. How many times had he been forced to prove his right to exist in spaces that his own achievements had earned him? How many times had he been reduced to nothing more than the color of his skin? "Officers," he said, maintaining his composure despite the growing hostility. "If you'd like to see some identification, I'd be happy to provide it. You'll find that I am indeed the homeowner here." Martinez stepped closer, his face flushed with anger at what he perceived as continued defiance. "Oh, you've got identification? Let me guess, it's fake, right? Stolen from some white guy you mugged?" The accusation was groundless and inflammatory, designed to provoke a reaction that could justify further aggression. Marcus remained perfectly still, understanding that any movement could be interpreted as threatening. "My wallet is in my back pocket," he said calmly. "I'm going to reach for it slowly so you can verify my identity." But Martinez was beyond reason, fueled by prejudice, and the intoxicating power that came with his badge and gun. "Don't you dare move," he shouted, his hand now gripping his weapon. "You think we're stupid? You think we don't know what guys like you are really up to?" The situation was spiraling toward violence with terrifying speed. Rodriguez and Stevens had positioned themselves to block any potential escape routes, while Martinez continued his verbal assault. The pool filter that Marcus had been cleaning lay forgotten on the concrete, a mundane reminder of how quickly an ordinary afternoon could turn into a nightmare. Mrs. Patterson watched from her kitchen window, her phone in hand, ready to call for backup if needed. Other neighbors had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion but careful to maintain what they considered a safe distance. None of them thought to intervene or question whether the police response was proportionate to whatever crime they believed was being committed. "Get on the ground. Now!" Martinez screamed, his voice cracking with adrenaline and rage. "Face down, hands behind your back." Marcus knew that compliance was his only option. Resistance, even verbal protests, could escalate the situation to deadly force. With careful, deliberate movements, he lowered himself to the hot concrete of his own driveway, the surface burning against his skin through his wet t-shirt. The officers descended on him like predators, their hands rough and unnecessarily violent, as they forced his arms behind his back. Martinez placed his knee firmly against Marcus's neck, applying pressure that made breathing difficult. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the humiliation of being brutalized in front of his own home by people who were supposed to serve and protect. "What's a piece of garbage like you doing in a neighborhood like this?" Rodriguez demanded, his voice filled with contempt. "You dealing drugs? Stealing from these good people?" Stevens joined the verbal assault, his words chosen specifically to dehumanize and degrade. "Probably some gang member thinking he can hide out in the suburbs. Well, we got news for you, boy, we don't tolerate your kind around here." The racial epithet hung in the air like poison, a word chosen deliberately to remind Marcus of his supposed place in their social hierarchy. He bit down on his anger, knowing that any response would be used against him. The concrete was burning his cheek, but he remained motionless, focusing on staying alive, rather than maintaining dignity. Martinez continued applying pressure to Marcus's neck, while Rodriguez began searching his pockets, looking for drugs, weapons, or anything that could justify their aggressive response. They were confident in their authority, certain that they were dealing with just another black criminal who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. But when Rodriguez's fingers closed around the leather wallet in Marcus's back pocket and pulled out its contents, everything changed in an instant. The police chief's badge gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its official seal and identification number clearly visible to all three officers. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Martinez's knee lifted from Marcus's neck as if the contact had suddenly become electrified. Rodriguez dropped the badge like it was on fire, his hands trembling as he stared at the impossible reality of what he was seeing. Stevens took several involuntary steps backward, his face going pale as the implications began to sink in. For several seconds, nobody moved. The badge lay on the concrete between them, a small piece of metal that had completely transformed the power dynamic. The man they had been brutalizing was not some random criminal. He was their ultimate superior, the person who could end their careers with a phone call. Marcus remained on the ground for a moment longer, allowing the officers to fully comprehend their situation. When he finally pushed himself up to his knees and then to his feet, his movements were slow and deliberate, like a judge preparing to pass sentence. He brushed the dirt from his shirt and shorts, his eyes never leaving the three officers who stood frozen in terror. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority, "I am Chief Marcus Williams of the Denver Police Department. This is my home, where I have lived peacefully for 8 years. And you have just provided me with a very clear demonstration of the kind of policing that has been destroying trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve." The words hit the officers like physical blows. Martinez opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, realizing that anything he said would only make their situation worse. Rodriguez was visibly shaking, the full weight of his actions finally becoming clear. Stevens had gone completely silent, his earlier bravado replaced by the sick realization that his career was probably over. Marcus picked up his badge and returned it to his wallet, each movement precise and controlled. The neighbors who had been watching from their windows and doorsteps were now openly staring, many of them recording the scene with their smartphones. The video would be online within hours, but Marcus was already thinking beyond the immediate scandal. "Chief Williams," Martinez finally managed to stammer, his voice barely audible, We didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Marcus replied, his tone remaining calm despite the rage burning in his chest. "You saw a black man and immediately assumed criminality. You used racial slurs and excessive force against someone you believed to be powerless to fight back. The fact that I happen to be your boss doesn't change what you did, it only changes the consequences you'll face." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the neighbors had stopped their whispered conversations, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. Mrs. Patterson had disappeared from her window, probably realizing that her false report had triggered an incident that would make national news. Rodriguez made a weak attempt at an apology, but Marcus held up his hand to stop him. "Don't apologize to me," he said. "Apologize to every black citizen who has been subjected to this kind of treatment by officers under my command. Apologize to your badges, which you have dishonored. And apologize to your families. who will have to live with the shame of what you've done here today. The three officers stood in stunned silence as Marcus walked toward his house, his dignity intact despite everything they had tried to do to destroy it. He paused at his front door and turned back to face them one final time. "Officers Martinez, Rodriguez, and Stevens," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "You are hereby suspended pending a full investigation. Your weapons and badges will be surrendered immediately. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chen will be contacting you within the hour to arrange for your formal statements." The transformation was complete. The men who had arrived as predators were leaving as prey, their futures uncertain, their reputations destroyed. They climbed back into their patrol car with the mechanical movements of people in shock, probably still struggling to process what had just happened. As the police car disappeared around the corner, Marcus stood on his porch and surveyed his neighborhood with new eyes. The people who had been watching began to drift back to their homes, but he could feel their stares, could almost hear their whispered conversations about what they had witnessed. Within hours, cell phone videos of the incident were spreading across social media platforms, generating millions of views and sparking outrage across the country. The images were stark and powerful: a black man being brutalized by police officers on his own property, followed by the shocking revelation of his true identity. News organizations picked up the story quickly, with headlines that captured both the injustice and the irony of the situation. "Police chief assaulted by his own officers," read the front page of the Denver Post. Cable news networks ran the footage on continuous loops, using it as a launching point for broader discussions about police brutality and racial profiling. The three officers found themselves at the center of a media firestorm that destroyed any hope they might have had for quiet resolution. Their names and faces were broadcast nationwide, their actions dissected by legal experts and civil rights advocates who used the incident to highlight systemic problems within law enforcement. Public reaction was swift and intense. Thousands of people gathered outside police headquarters, demanding justice, while online activists organized boycotts and protests across the city. The fact that the victim was a police chief himself seemed to crystallize public anger about law enforcement's treatment of black citizens. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being both the victim of police brutality and the person responsible for addressing it. The contradiction was not lost on him, or on the community leaders who demanded immediate action. How could he credibly lead a police force that included officers willing to brutalize their own chief? 3 days after the incident, Marcus called a press conference to address the situation publicly. The room was packed with reporters, activists, and citizens who wanted to hear how the department would respond. He approached the podium wearing his full dress uniform, every medal and decoration a reminder of his decades of service. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of what he was about to say. "I stand before you today, not just as your police chief, but as a black man who has experienced firsthand the kind of treatment that too many citizens endure at the hands of those sworn to protect them." He paused, allowing the significance of his words to settle over the room. "If I, with all my authority, all my credentials, all my years of service, can be subjected to racial profiling and excessive force, then what hope do ordinary citizens have? What does this say about the culture within our own department?" Marcus went on to detail the systematic changes he would be implementing, from enhanced bias training to new accountability measures for officers who violated citizens' rights. He announced the creation of a civilian oversight board with real power to investigate misconduct, and promised that the 3 officers involved would face criminal charges as well as departmental discipline. "This incident has exposed uncomfortable truths about policing in America," he continued. "But it has also created an opportunity for real change. We can either use this moment to transform our department into a model for the nation, or we can waste it on empty promises and cosmetic reforms." The press conference lasted nearly 2 hours, with Marcus answering every question with the kind of directness that had earned him respect throughout his career. He did not shy away from difficult topics, or attempt to minimize the significance of what had happened. Instead, he used his own victimization as a catalyst for broader reform. In the weeks that followed, Marcus became a national figure in discussions about police reform. He testified before congressional committees, spoke at universities, and worked with civil rights organizations to develop new training protocols that could be adopted by departments across the country. The 3 officers who had assaulted him were eventually convicted on federal civil rights charges and sentenced to prison terms. Their careers in law enforcement were over, their pensions forfeited, their reputations permanently destroyed. The legal proceedings served as a powerful reminder that badge and uniform did not place anyone above the law. But Marcus understood that individual accountability was only part of the solution. He used his position and newfound visibility to push for systemic changes that would prevent future incidents. New hiring practices, enhanced psychological screening, and mandatory cultural competency training became standard throughout the Denver Police Department. The neighborhood on Elm Street changed as well. Mrs. Patterson moved away quietly 6 months after the incident, unable to face the daily reminder of her role in triggering the assault. Other neighbors made efforts to reach out to Marcus, some offering genuine apologies, while others simply tried to repair relationships damaged by years of suspicion and hostility. Marcus continued living in his home, tending his garden, and maintaining his pool, but now he did so as a symbol of both the problems and possibilities of American policing. Children in the neighborhood would sometimes stop to talk with him, drawn by curiosity about the man who had become famous for being attacked by his own officers. 1 year after the incident, Marcus announced his retirement from law enforcement, citing a desire to focus on teaching and advocacy work. His final day as chief was marked by ceremonies and tributes, but also by the knowledge that his most lasting contribution had come not from his years of leadership, but from a single afternoon when he was forced to confront the ugly reality of racial prejudice within his own ranks. The swimming pool that had been the site of his routine maintenance work became something of a landmark, visited by people who wanted to see where an ordinary moment had been transformed into a catalyst for change. Marcus would often find notes left by visitors, thanking him for his courage and his commitment to justice. In his retirement speech, Marcus reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought him to that moment. "I never wanted to be famous for being brutalized," he said. "But if my experience can help create a more just society, then perhaps some good can come from something that should never have happened in the first place." The audience that day included many of the officers who served under his command, men and women who had learned from his example about the kind of leadership that puts principle above personal comfort. They understood that Marcus had used his own victimization not as an excuse for bitterness, but as motivation for transformation. As Marcus walked away from the podium that final time, his steps were those of a man who had faced his greatest test and emerged with his integrity intact. The badge he had carried for so many years was gone, but the principles it had represented lived on in the changes he had fought to implement. The story of Chief Marcus Williams serves as both a cautionary tale about the persistence of racial prejudice and an inspiring example of how one person's courage can catalyze meaningful change. His experience reminds us that justice is not automatic, that progress requires constant vigilance, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply the willingness to tell the truth about what happened in your own backyard on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon.